The wind howled through the jagged peaks of Alaska's remote mountain range as our group of 6 made our final preparations at base camp. The morning sun barely penetrated the thick cloud cover, casting an eerie gray light over the snow-capped peaks that loomed before us. I watched as Elena checked her equipment one last time, her practiced hands moving with the precision I'd come to expect from years of archaeological expeditions. "The weather's holding for now," Mason announced, looking up from his satellite weather tracker. His rugged features betrayed no emotion, but I'd known him long enough to detect the slight edge of concern in his voice. As our resident wilderness expert, his instincts had saved us from more than one close call in the past. Sophia sat apart from the group, her pen moving rapidly across the pages of her leather-bound journal. She'd barely spoken since we'd arrived at base camp, but that wasn't unusual. As a writer, she preferred to process the world through written words rather than spoken ones. The way her dark eyes darted between the mountains and her journal told me she was already crafting the narrative of our expedition in her mind. "The geological formations in this range are unlike anything I've ever seen," Chloe called out, her voice carrying a note of excitement as she studied the rocky outcroppings through her high-powered binoculars. Her enthusiasm for rock formations might have seemed strange to outsiders, but as a geologist, she saw stories in stone that the rest of us could only imagine. Ethan was busy organizing his collection of sampling equipment, muttering to himself about the potential for discovering new species in such an isolated environment. His background in evolutionary biology made him the perfect person to document any unusual findings we might encounter. The way his hands trembled slightly as he packed his gear betrayed his excitement. Lucas moved through our camp like a ghost, his camera clicking constantly as he documented every moment. As a successful tech entrepreneur, he could have been anywhere in the world, but he'd chosen to join our expedition. His drone buzzed overhead, capturing panoramic footage of the landscape that stretched endlessly before us. "Everyone ready?" Elena asked, shouldering her heavy pack. She didn't wait for an answer before starting up the narrow trail that would take us higher into the mountains. That was Elena, always moving forward, always pushing boundaries. Her curiosity about the unknown had led us to some remarkable discoveries over the years, but something about this expedition felt different. The ascent was grueling, the air grew thinner with each step, and the wind cut through our thermal gear like icy knives. Mason led the way, carefully choosing each foothold on the treacherous terrain. The rocks were slick with ice, and one wrong step could send any of us plummeting into the abyss below. "Look at these rock formations," Chloe called out, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. "The stratification patterns are completely inconsistent with what we should be seeing at this altitude." She ran her gloved hand over the dark stone, her brow furrowed in concentration. Ethan paused to collect samples of an unusual moss that seemed to glow faintly even in the dim light. "The cellular structure of these plants must be remarkable to survive at this altitude," he mused, carefully storing the specimens in his collection vials. As we rounded a particularly treacherous bend in the path, Lucas's drone captured something that would change our lives forever. "Elena," he called out, his voice tight with excitement. "You need to see this." We gathered around his tablet, watching as the drone's camera revealed a dark opening in the mountainside, almost completely hidden by thick vegetation. The entrance was narrow, but definitely man-made, or at least that's what we thought at the time. "That's not on any of our maps," Mason said, his usual skepticism giving way to curiosity, "and these mountains have been thoroughly surveyed." Elena's eyes lit up with the same fire I'd seen before every major discovery she'd made. "We need to check it out," she said, already adjusting her course toward the hidden entrance. The vegetation around the cave entrance was like nothing I'd ever seen before. The vines were thick as my arm and seemed to pulse with an inner light, while the moss grew in spiraling patterns that made my eyes hurt if I looked at them too long. Sophia had stopped writing and was simply staring, her journal forgotten in her hands. "The air coming from the cave," Ethan said, his scientific detachment slipping for a moment. "It smells wrong." He was right. There was something ancient in that smell, something that didn't belong in our world of steel and silicon. Lucas stepped forward, his camera capturing every detail of the entrance. "We'd be crazy not to explore this," he said, his entrepreneur's instinct for opportunity overriding any sense of caution. None of us could have known then what that decision would mean. None of us could have imagined the horrors that waited in the darkness beyond that strange entrance. But as we switched on our headlamps and stepped into the darkness, we crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. The cave swallowed us whole, its darkness absolute beyond the reach of our lights. The air grew thicker with each step, heavy with the weight of countless ages. The walls were smooth in places, rough in others, but everywhere they were covered in carvings unlike anything Elena had ever encountered in her years of archaeological work. "These symbols," she murmured, her fingers tracing the strange patterns. "They're not just decorative. There's a language here, a story, but it's nothing like any human writing system I've ever seen." The passage narrowed as we ventured deeper, the ceiling dropping so low that even Sophia, the shortest among us, had to duck. The air grew heavier, filling our lungs with each breath like we were drinking rather than breathing. Our headlamps created shifting shadows that seemed to move independently of our movements, dancing across the carved walls in ways that defied natural law. "Listen," Mason whispered, holding up his hand for us to stop. We stood in complete stillness, and that's when we noticed it. The absolute absence of sound. No dripping water, no echo of our movements, no distant rumble of the mountain above us. The silence was complete, unnatural, as if the very concept of sound ceased to exist beyond our immediate space. Chloe knelt to examine the cave floor, her gloved hand running over the smooth stone. "This isn't right," she muttered, more to herself than to us. "The erosion patterns, the mineral composition, none of it matches what we should be seeing in a natural cave system." She pulled out a small device to measure the rock's density, but the screen remained blank, as if something was interfering with its readings. Lucas attempted to send his drone ahead to scout the passage, but the controls became unresponsive after just a few meters. "There's some kind of interference," he said, his voice tight with frustration as he was forced to retrieve it manually. "All my equipment's acting strange." The passage eventually opened into a vast chamber that defied all logic. Our lights seemed to be swallowed by the darkness, barely illuminating the space immediately around us. The ceiling vanished into the blackness above, and the far walls, if they existed, remained hidden in shadow. But it was what lay at the center of the chamber that stopped us in our tracks. A massive archway stood alone in the middle of the space, its surface rippling like liquid mercury but somehow remaining perfectly vertical. The air around it shimmered with an otherworldly light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with our heartbeat. "This is impossible," Ethan breathed, his scientific skepticism warring with what his eyes were telling him. He pulled out his sampling kit, but his hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the equipment. Elena stepped closer to the arch, her face illuminated by its strange glow. "The symbols here are different," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "They're more urgent, like a warning, maybe, or..." She never finished that sentence. As she approached, the surface of the arch began to shift more rapidly, its mercurial surface swirling with increasing speed. A low hum filled the chamber, building in intensity until we could feel it in our bones. "Elena, get back," Mason shouted, but it was too late. The pull had already begun, subtle at first but quickly becoming irresistible. Elena tried to step away from the arch, but her movements were sluggish, as if she were walking through thick syrup. Sophia's journal clattered to the ground as she reached for Elena, trying to pull her back. The rest of us moved to help, but the force had become overwhelming. The humming reached a fever pitch, and the light from the arch grew blindingly bright. I felt my feet leave the ground, my body drawn toward the arch along with the others. The world around us began to distort, reality bending and twisting like a reflection in a funhouse mirror. The last thing I remember before everything went white was Chloe's voice, barely audible over the deafening hum. "The chamber, it's starting to collapse." Then we were falling, tumbling through space and time, our screams swallowed by the void. Colors that had no name in any human language swirled around us, and sensations that defied description assaulted our senses. It felt like being torn apart and put back together 1,000 times in a single instant. When consciousness returned, we found ourselves lying on ground that felt both solid and somehow wrong. The air that filled our lungs was thick and sweet, carrying scents that no human nose had ever encountered before. As my vision cleared, I looked up at a sky that should not exist, a swirling maelstrom of colors that hurt to look at directly. We had crossed over into somewhere else, somewhere that had never known the touch of human feet, somewhere that had evolved along a completely different path than our own world. Ethan was the first to stand, his biologist's curiosity overriding his fear. Around us, massive plants unlike anything in Earth's evolutionary history swayed in an unfelt breeze. Their structures defied conventional botanical logic. Stems that seemed to be made of something between metal and flesh, leaves that moved with apparent purpose, and flowers that emitted a soft, pulsing glow. "The atmospheric composition must be different here," he said, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and excitement as he pulled out his testing equipment. "Yet, we can breathe it. It's as if this atmosphere evolved specifically to support complex life, but through a completely different chemical pathway than Earth's." Mason helped Elena to her feet, his trained eyes scanning our surroundings for immediate threats. The ground beneath us had a slightly springy quality, like walking on living tissue. Each step produced a subtle response from the surface, as if the very earth was aware of our presence. "The geological composition is unlike anything I've ever seen," Chloe said, kneeling to examine the ground. "It's as if the entire surface is semi-organic. The rock formations aren't just minerals. They're some kind of silicon-organic hybrid." Lucas had somehow managed to keep hold of his camera during the transition. He raised it to capture our alien surroundings but lowered it almost immediately. "The battery's dead," he announced, his voice tight with tension. "So is my phone. All our electronic equipment seems to be drained." Sophia had retrieved her journal from where it had fallen during the crossing. Her hands shook as she wrote, trying to capture in words what we were seeing. "The colors," she whispered. "There are colors here that don't exist in our world. How do I describe something that human language has no words for?" A sound drew our attention skyward, something between a bird's cry and a whale's song, but with harmonics that made our skin crawl. Through the swirling colors of the alien sky, we caught glimpses of flying creatures. Their movements were fluid, almost hypnotic, their bodies seemingly changing shape as they moved through the air. "We need to find shelter," Mason said, his survival instincts kicking in. "Night will be coming, and we have no idea what that means in this place." Elena pointed to a cluster of towering structures in the distance. At first glance they looked like trees, but as we watched, we could see them slowly shifting and changing, their branches moving with deliberate purpose. "Those might provide some cover," she suggested, "and they might give us a better vantage point to understand where we are." As we made our way toward the structures, the environment around us became increasingly active. The ground beneath our feet seemed to react more strongly to our presence, and the plant-like organisms around us began tracking our movements. Small creatures that looked like a cross between insects and crystals scuttled away from our approach, their translucent bodies catching and refracting the strange light. Then we saw them, our first glimpse of this world's dominant species. They emerged from behind one of the moving structures with a grace that seemed to defy physics. Their bodies were vaguely humanoid in shape, but that's where any similarity to humans ended. They stood at least 9 feet tall, their bodies covered in what looked like a combination of scales and feathers that shifted color as they moved. Their limbs were long and fluid, capable of movements that would be impossible for human anatomy, and their faces. "Don't look directly at their faces," Ethan warned, his voice barely above a whisper. "The structure of their features, it's doing something to my brain, like an optical illusion that won't resolve." The creatures moved toward us with a predatory grace that sent primal fear racing through our bodies. They communicated with each other through a series of clicks and rumbles that seemed to bypass our ears and vibrate directly in our minds. Their movements were coordinated in a way that made it clear they were intelligent, and that they had us surrounded. "Nobody make any sudden moves," Mason cautioned, though we were all too terrified to do anything but stand perfectly still. The creatures circled us, their bodies flowing like liquid mercury, their not quite faces studying us with an intelligence that felt ancient and alien. One of them reached out with a limb that seemed to both be there and not there at the same time. Its movement was almost gentle as it touched Elena's face, but the moment its skin made contact with hers, everything changed. Elena's eyes went wide, her body rigid, as if she was experiencing something beyond human comprehension. When the creature withdrew its touch, Elena collapsed to her knees, gasping. "They're not just intelligent," she managed to say between ragged breaths. "They're beyond intelligent. They're... A high-pitched screech cut through the air, causing the creatures to snap their attention toward the darkening sky. Without warning, they retreated, their movements so fluid, they seemed to pour away into the shadows of the living landscape. The silence they left behind was deafening. "What did they show you?" Sophia asked Elena, helping her to her feet. "What did you see?" Elena's face had gone pale, her eyes haunted. "I saw their history," she whispered. "I saw what they did to the ones who came before. I saw what they'll do to us if we stay here too long." The light in the alien sky began to dim, but not like any sunset we'd ever seen. Instead of the sun setting, it was as if the very atmosphere was becoming opaque, turning the swirling colors above us into deep, troubling shades of purple and black. The temperature dropped rapidly, and the vegetation around us began to move with more purpose, more awareness. "We need to find shelter now," Mason insisted, pointing to a formation of rock-like structures nearby. "Those outcroppings look solid enough to protect us through the night." As we made our way toward the formation, Chloe suddenly stopped, her eyes wide with realization. "Wait," she said, her voice shaking. "These aren't rock formations. They're growing. Look at the patterns. They're expanding upward at a visible rate." She was right. What we had taken for stone was actually some kind of living crystal, pushing up from the ground like accelerated stalagmites. The surface rippled and flowed, creating new formations even as we watched. "The whole ecosystem is connected," Ethan observed, his scientific detachment slipping as fear crept into his voice. "Everything here, the ground, the plants, those creatures, they were all part of one massive, living system." Lucas pointed to a dark opening at the base of one of the larger formations. "There, that looks stable at least." The opening appeared to be a natural cavity reminiscent of the cave that had brought us to this nightmare world. We barely made it inside before the night fell completely. The darkness that descended was absolute, broken only by the bioluminescent glow of small, fungus-like growths that dotted the cavity walls. Their light pulsed slowly, like a heartbeat, casting moving shadows that made it impossible to tell if we were truly alone in the space. Sophia had been writing frantically in her journal, trying to capture every detail of our ordeal. "Elena," she said softly, "what exactly did you see when that thing touched you?" Elena huddled against the wall, her usual confidence shattered. I saw their evolution. They weren't always like this. They grew, they changed, they consumed. There were others here once. Primitive versions of what might have become human. But these beings..." She shuddered. "They didn't just kill them. They absorbed them, made them part of their collective consciousness." A low rumble shook the ground beneath us, and the bioluminescent pulses quickened their rhythm. Outside, we could hear something massive moving through the alien landscape. "They hunt at night," Elena continued, her voice barely a whisper, "but not like anything on Earth. They don't just kill for food or territory. They hunt to understand, to absorb. Each creature they take becomes part of their hive mind, their shared consciousness." The rumbling grew closer, and with it came a sound that made our blood run cold. A sort of singing, but at frequencies that hurt our ears and made our vision blur. Through the opening of our shelter, we could see massive shapes moving in the darkness, their bodies blocking out the bioluminescent light of the various life forms that dotted the landscape. "There's something else," Elena said, her eyes fixed on the darkness beyond our shelter. "Something older than them, something they fear. I saw it in their memories. A darkness that consumes everything, even them. They call it the void that hungers." As if in response to her words, a new sound cut through the alien night. A sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was like 1,000 voices screaming in harmony, but with an undertone that spoke of infinite hunger and endless patience. The crystalline formations around us began to vibrate, their surfaces rippling with increasing intensity. Small pieces broke off and skittered across the ground, moving with purpose toward the darkness outside. The temperature's dropping fast, Mason warned, checking his survival gear. But it's not normal cold. It's like the heat is being actively drawn out of the air. Ethan, who had been examining the bioluminescent growths on the wall, suddenly jerked his hand back. "These aren't just giving off light," he said, his voice tight with panic. "They're responding to something. Look at the pattern." The pulses of light had indeed changed, forming complex patterns that rippled across the walls. As we watched, the patterns began to coalesce into recognizable shapes that looked disturbingly like the symbols we had seen in the cave that brought us here. Chloe pressed her hand against the wall, feeling the vibrations through her fingers. "These patterns, they're not random. It's like the walls are trying to tell us something." Her eyes widened suddenly. "Everyone, move, now." We barely had time to scramble away from the wall before it began to dissolve, the seemingly solid surface becoming liquid-like. Where Chloe's hand had been, the wall now rippled outward, revealing a deeper passage that hadn't been there before. "Look," Sophia whispered, pointing to the ground. Our footprints in the dusty floor were slowly filling with a black, oil-like substance that seemed to move with purpose. The liquid began to form into those same mysterious symbols we'd seen before. Elena moved closer, her archaeological training overriding her fear. "These symbols, they're older than the beings outside. They're telling a story, showing us something about this world." She began to translate, her voice growing more urgent with each symbol she deciphered. "This world, it wasn't always like this. The beings we saw, they weren't the first intelligent life here. There was something else, something that evolved alongside them. The two species lived in balance until..." She stopped, her face draining of color. A distant roar shook the ground, closer than before. The black liquid symbols began moving faster, more frantically. "Until what?" Lucas demanded, his camera forgotten in his hands. "Until the void came," Elena continued. "It started small, just a tiny tear in reality, but it grew, it consumed. The two species tried to fight it together, but the void was endless. Those who weren't devoured began to change. The survivors, they became the beings we saw outside. They transformed themselves, evolved rapidly, trying to survive. But the price..." Another roar, even closer. The bioluminescent lights pulsed faster, their glow taking on a reddish tinge. Mason grabbed his pack, checking our remaining supplies. "We need to move deeper in. Whatever's out there, it's getting closer." "Wait," Ethan said, studying the black liquid symbols. "These aren't just a historical record. They're a warning. The void, it's still here, still growing, still hungry. And the beings outside, they're not just hunting us, they're running from it." The passage Chloe had discovered seemed to pulse with its own inner light, drawing us forward. We had no choice but to move deeper into the unknown. The sounds of pursuit grew louder behind us, a symphony of alien hunting calls mixed with that soul-chilling screech we'd come to associate with the void. As we moved through the passage, the walls continued to shift and flow around us. Strange, organic growths reached out like fingers, their surfaces covered in more of the glowing symbols. The air grew thicker, filled with spores that danced in the ethereal light. "The temperature's still dropping," Mason warned, his breath now visible in the cold air. "But it's not natural cold. It's like something is actively draining the heat." Sophia, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly grabbed Elena's arm. "Look at your watch," she said, her voice trembling. Elena lifted her wrist, and we all stared in horror. The digital display was cycling through numbers rapidly, moving both forward and backward in time. But that wasn't the worst part. Through the watch's glass face, we could see something moving, something dark and fluid that seemed to be trying to push its way through. Time itself is breaking down, Ethan realized, his scientific mind struggling to process what we were seeing. This place, it's not just a different world, it's a place where reality itself is coming apart. A high-pitched keening sound filled the air, and the passage behind us began to collapse. But it wasn't a natural cave-in. The walls were melting, flowing together like wax, and in the liquid surface, we could see reflections of things that couldn't possibly exist. "Run," Mason shouted, but the words seemed to hang in the air, distorting and echoing as if time itself was stuttering. We pushed forward through the twisting passage, our movements becoming increasingly difficult as reality continued to break down around us. The tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber that defied all logic. The ceiling arched impossibly high, lost in darkness, while pillars of living crystal pulsed with internal light. But it was what lay at the center of the chamber that stopped us in our tracks. A massive structure rose from the ground, its architecture unlike anything human minds could comprehend. It appeared to be a temple, but one built by beings who understood space and time in ways we couldn't grasp. The walls seemed to fold in on themselves, creating patterns that hurt to look at directly. "Oh God," Chloe breathed, her geologist's training failing to make sense of what she was seeing. The entire structure, it's growing, like a crystal, but wrong. It's growing in directions that don't exist. Elena moved closer to the temple walls, her hands shaking as she traced the symbols that covered its surface. "This is older than the beings outside," she said. "Older than the void even. This was built by the original inhabitants of this world." A deep rumble shook the chamber, and dark liquid began seeping from the walls. Not the same communicative substance we'd seen before. This was something else, something alive and aware and hungry. "The void," Ethan whispered, backing away from the encroaching darkness. "It's not just a force of nature, it's conscious. It's been waiting for us." The liquid began to take shape, forming into a towering mass that seemed to absorb all light around it. Within its shifting surface, we could see faces. Not human faces, but not like the beings outside either. These were the faces of the original inhabitants, preserved in their moment of absorption into the darkness. Lucas, who had been filming despite his camera's dead battery, suddenly cried out in surprise. "The camera," he said, holding it up. "It's working again, but look at what it's recording." On the small display screen, we could see not just the chamber we were in, but hundreds of other realities layered on top of each other. In some, the temple was whole and magnificent. In others, it was a crumbling ruin. And in others still, it was something our minds couldn't process at all. Sophia had gone very still, her writer's eye taking in every detail even as her hands trembled too much to write. "The temple," she said slowly, "it's not just a building, it's a nexus point. A place where all possible realities converge." The dark mass continued to grow, pushing us toward the temple's entrance. The beings from outside had followed us, but now they too were retreating from the darkness. In the shifting light, we could see their true forms, beings of pure energy and thought, trapped in physical bodies they had created to survive. "There's something inside the temple," Elena said, her voice tight with sudden realization. "Something the original inhabitants left behind. A way to stop this." Mason checked our supplies, his face grim. "We don't have much choice. Whatever's in there has to be better than what's out here." As we entered the temple, the air changed. It became thicker, charged with potential. Our movements left trails in the air, like ripples in a pond, but these ripples seemed to affect the very fabric of reality around us. The temple's interior was a maze of impossible geometry, with stairs that led in directions that couldn't exist, and corridors that looped back on themselves in ways that defied physics. But through it all, there was a sense of purpose, as if the building itself was trying to guide us somewhere. "The symbols are changing," Elena noted as we moved deeper into the structure. "They're not just telling the history anymore, they're telling us what we need to do." The walls around us began to pulse with an inner light, and in that light, we could see shadows moving, not our shadows, but those of the original inhabitants. They were showing us something, teaching us through images and impressions that bypassed our conscious minds and spoke directly to our deepest understanding. Sophia stumbled, her hands pressed against her temples. "I can see them," she gasped. "The original inhabitants. They weren't just one species. They were two races that evolved together in perfect symbiosis. One of pure energy, one of pure matter. They built this temple together as a bridge between their two forms of existence." The temperature in the temple plummeted suddenly, and that soul-chilling screech of the void echoed through the impossible corridors. The shadows on the walls became more frantic, their movements urgent and desperate. They're trying to show us how to stop it, Elena said, her eyes wide as she absorbed the knowledge being transmitted. The void, it's not just consuming matter and energy, it's consuming possibility itself. Every reality it devours makes it stronger, more hungry. Lucas's camera was capturing everything, its screen showing layers of reality bleeding into each other. Look at this, he said, pointing to the display. The temple exists in every reality simultaneously. It's the only constant across all possible worlds. The ground beneath our feet began to vibrate, and the crystalline growths that dotted the temple walls started to shatter, their fragments floating upward as if gravity itself was breaking down. Through the gaps in the walls, we could see the void approaching, a massive, writhing darkness that consumed everything in its path. There, Chloe pointed to a doorway ahead that seemed to bend and twist in impossible ways. The shadows are all pointing that way. Whatever we need to find is through there. We pushed forward, but movement was becoming increasingly difficult. The air had become thick and resistant, as if we were trying to walk through invisible syrup. Each step required enormous effort, and the very act of moving seemed to distort the space around us. The doorway led to a circular chamber that defied all laws of physics. The floor curved upward to become the walls, which in turn became the ceiling without any clear transition point. In the center of the room, suspended in midair, was a sphere of pure light that hurt to look at directly. The Nexus, Ethan breathed, his scientific mind struggling to process what he was seeing. It's what they use to maintain the balance between all possible realities. The shadows on the walls were moving faster now, more urgently. Through their movements they showed us what had happened, how the void had first appeared as a tiny tear in reality, how it had grown by consuming possibilities, and how the original inhabitants had sacrificed themselves to contain it. They didn't fail, Elena realized, her voice filled with awe. They succeeded, but the price was too high. They had to merge themselves with the temple itself, becoming living guardians to keep the void contained. But now the containment is failing, Mason finished, his practical mind grasping the situation. And if it breaks completely... A massive tremor shook the chamber, and through the doorway we could see the void approaching. Its darkness was absolute, but somehow we could see the faces of everything it had consumed writhing within its depths. The beings from outside, the evolved survivors of this world, were fleeing before it, their bodies shifting and changing as they ran. Sophia stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the sphere of light. I understand now, she said softly, why we're here, why the temple called to us. It needs new guardians, the original inhabitants. They're too weak now, they've been holding back the void for too long. But that would mean... Lucas started, his voice trailing off as the implications became clear. The sphere of light pulsed, and in its radiance, we could see what needed to be done. One of us would have to merge with the temple, become part of its eternal vigilance against the darkness. The others would have a chance to escape, to return to our world, but whoever stayed would remain forever, their consciousness spread across all possible realities. The void reached the doorway, its darkness beginning to consume the edges of our reality. We had moments to decide, to choose who would make the ultimate sacrifice. It has to be me, Sophia said quietly, her voice steady despite the terror surrounding us. I understand now why I was drawn to write everything down. I wasn't just documenting our journey, I was preparing myself to become the story. Sophia, no. Elena reached for her, but Sophia was already moving toward the sphere of light. Think about it, Sophia continued, her eyes reflecting the otherworldly glow. Each of you has something vital to bring back to our world. Elena, your archaeological knowledge. Ethan, your understanding of evolution. Chloe, your geological discoveries. Lucas, your footage. Mason, your survival skills. But me, I'm a writer. My job is to observe, to understand, to preserve. And that's exactly what the temple needs. The void surged forward, its darkness consuming more of the chamber. The beings from outside pressed against the walls, their bodies melding with the temple's structure as they tried to escape the encroaching darkness. Their alien screams filled the air with a symphony of terror. The original inhabitants, Sophia explained, now standing directly beneath the sphere of light. They preserved themselves in the temple's walls to maintain the barrier between realities, but they're tired. They've been holding back the darkness for too long. They need someone new, someone who can understand and tell their story across all possible worlds. The sphere of light began to descend, its radiance intensifying. Sophia's journal fell from her hands, its pages fluttering open to reveal not just her writing, but symbols like those on the temple walls. Symbols she had unconsciously been drawing throughout our journey. "Get back to the entrance," she commanded, her voice taking on an ethereal quality. "When I merge with the temple, you'll have moments to escape before reality resets itself. The original inhabitants will show you the way." The shadows on the walls began moving faster, forming a path back through the impossible geometry of the temple. Mason grabbed Elena's arm as she tried to rush towards Sophia. "We have to go," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Her sacrifice won't mean anything if we don't survive to remember it." The sphere of light touched Sophia's outstretched hands and her body began to glow from within. Her form became translucent, her consciousness visibly spreading through the temple's structure. Her voice echoed from everywhere and nowhere. "Run, run now." We ran, through twisting corridors that folded in on themselves, upstairs that defied gravity, past walls that rippled with the memories of a million different realities. Behind us, we could hear the void's furious screech as it encountered new resistance. Sophia's consciousness joining with the ancient guardians to strengthen the barriers between worlds. The temple began to shake violently, reality itself buckling under the strain of what was happening. The beings from outside ran with us, no longer predators but fellow survivors fleeing the darkness. Their bodies flickered between forms as the laws of physics started to reassert themselves. Lucas's camera captured it all, the impossible architecture collapsing, the darkness being pushed back, the light of Sophia's sacrifice spreading through the temple's structure. Through his lens we could see her consciousness manifesting in every reality simultaneously, becoming part of the eternal vigil against the void. We burst out of the temple into the alien landscape, but it was already changing. The ground beneath our feet became more solid, the strange plants retreating, the swirling sky stabilizing. Reality was reforming itself, pushing us back toward our own world. The portal appeared before us, its surface now stable and clear. Through it we could see the cave where our journey had begun. The beings from outside herded us toward it, their bodies becoming more solid, more recognizable as they adapted to the strengthened laws of physics. As we crossed the threshold back into our world, Elena looked back one last time. In that final moment, she saw Sophia's face in every surface of the temple, in every reality simultaneously. Her expression was one of peace, of purpose found, of duty accepted. The cave sealed itself behind us, the walls becoming solid, ordinary rock. But not before we heard Sophia's voice one last time, echoing through every possible version of reality. There are places on this earth where time itself breaks, and we found one of them, but more importantly, we found out why they exist, and why they must be guarded. I am the guardian now, the keeper of stories across all possible worlds. And as long as I remember, as long as I watch, as long as I write the endless story of existence, the void cannot win. We emerged into our own world changed forever. Lucas's camera held the only proof of our journey, footage that showed glimpses of impossible things, of realities that shouldn't exist, of sacrifices made to keep the darkness at bay. Sophia's journal remained behind, transformed into something more than paper and ink. In the years that followed, others would find similar journals in various places around the world, all in Sophia's handwriting, all telling slightly different versions of the same story, all warning of the places where reality wears thin. And sometimes, in the deepest part of night, when the barriers between worlds grow weak, we can hear her voice on the wind, still telling the story, still keeping watch, still holding back the darkness that hungers for all possible worlds.